75 or 76 participants. So I'm gonna continue. All right, welcome to TWU Celebrates Constitution Day as we honor the centennial of the 19th Amendment, women's right to vote. We have a panel of scholars who will discuss the 19th Amendment, just the beginning. I'm Susan Whitmer, Chair of Constitution Day, and I'm joined with co-chair Tammy Key, who will provide questions for our speakers. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items so you know how to participate in today's event. This program is best viewed in speaker view by clicking on the view option in the upper right-hand side of your screen. You'll change gallery view to speaker view. During the webinar, you'll have the opportunity to submit your questions into chat. Your video is muted for this presentation. As time allows, the speakers will address as many questions as they can during the Q&A session at the end of the presentation. We're recording this webinar and we will share the link with all registrants after the event. Now, I'd like to introduce our esteemed panelists. Dr. Rachel Gunter is a professor of history at Collin College. Dr. Gunter will discuss suffrage and how it changed voting for many groups. We have two Texas women's professors to discuss race and equality issues in voting. Dr. Christina Bejarano, professor in the Department of History and Political Science, and Dr. Nila Ricks, chair of the Department of Social Work. And she's wearing an awesome suffragist t-shirt today. We're going to start today's program with a 3-minute film clip from Citizens at Last, the history of Texas suffrage. Dr. Nancy Schiesari, professor of radio, television, film at the University of Texas at Austin, and film producer Ellen Temple are with us to discuss the film. Here's Nancy Schiesari to introduce the film clip. After you, Nancy, go ahead.
Thank you so much, Susan. Thanks everybody for being here. And we'd like to introduce the film with just the first 3 minutes of the film, which gives you a little bit of the idea of what's really going to stop suffrage and what's going to be the problem for our suffragists that are in the film, and then later for women of color. So you could roll this.
Bear with us, we're apparently having a little bit of technical difficulty.
I'll go ahead and bring it up right now. I think maybe we didn't know who was going to do it, so I'll share it right now.
Gotcha, thank you.
Thanks.
When construction ended on the Texas state capitol in 1888, only one woman occupied a place of honor. She was the goddess of liberty, 16 feet tall and towering above the rest. Women in the United States had aspired to the right to vote for 70 years, fighting an uphill struggle to achieve their goal. But even after the passing of the 19th Amendment, not all women would have access to this privilege. Texas, like all the former Confederate states, was hostile territory for women's suffrage. In no southern state had suffragists been able to persuade legislators to grant women voting rights. From 1865 to 1919, women in Texas petitioned the state legislature 13 times to accept a resolution in support of the right to vote. And every time, the request was denied.
Dear Madam Folsom, I do not favor the agitation of women's suffrage at this time. There are to be considered many complications. Are those in favor of women's suffrage in favor of Negro women being allowed to vote? Representative Choice Boswell Randall, 1910.
The highest duties of citizenship are military service and jury service, which a woman, by her very nature, is incapable of performing. Senator Joseph W. Bailey, 1918.
I've always regarded women as being better than men. I raise my hat to her on the street and get up to give her a seat out of respect to her. But the question of surrendering our state's rights is the important issue. When you give the ballot to women, you make it possible for Negro equality such as you suffered after the Civil War. Governor Oscar Branch Colquitt.
Resolved by the people of Texas in convention assembled that the resolution recommending the incorporation of women's suffrage be expunged from the journals of this convention.
Thank you so much for sharing that clip with us. I'm really looking forward to next spring when we will show the entire documentary, Citizens at Last, at Texas Women's University. Today, we're discussing the 19th Amendment as a starting point that informed the fight for equal rights for the past 100 years. But the other day, Ellen Temple, the producer of that film, and I were talking, and she made some really good points that I think you should all consider. Ellen, could you share those points with us today? You're muted,
Ellen, I think you're on mute.
Oh, okay. Now I'm okay.
Yes.
Thank you. Okay. I just wanted to say how proud I am of my co-producer, Nancy Schiesari, and our team, including Rachel Gunter, for their persistence in making this film happen. We're close. And thinking about the Constitution, I was struck with how important the First Amendment was to the ratification of the 19th Amendment. For 70 years, the suffragists used First Amendment rights, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, the freedom to peacefully assemble, and the freedom to petition the government for a redress of grievances. Women used all those rights in their battle to secure ratification of the 19th Amendment, which was, as we know, an amazing achievement against all odds, as you could see from the film. And that was just the beginning of the effort to expand the right to vote. Black women and men had to continue the fight to repeal the Texas all-white primary in 1944, to ratify the 24th Constitutional Amendment to abolish the poll tax in 1964, and to pass the Voting Rights Act in 1965. With that continued expansion of the vote, the ongoing struggle for women's rights accelerated. In fact, I wonder if the right to vote secured by minorities and Black women beyond the 19th Amendment played a big role in bringing us the women's rights we enjoy today. It seems that every time we celebrate citizens voting at last, we move closer to the more perfect union that our Constitution promises. Thank you.
Thank you so much to Dr. Schiesari and Ellen Temple. We appreciate the important work you've done to explore and document specifically the Texas suffrage movement. To start our panel today, I'd like to dig into the suffrage movement itself a bit more. Dr. Gunter, thank you so much for being here. What were the suffragists specifically looking to gain through the right to vote, and how were women's rights limited at that time?
Women's rights were limited in a whole host of ways, and of course it depends on which women we're talking about as well. So a lot of the white suffragists we're talking about, they're interested in progressive reforms, just like Black suffragists and Latina suffragists are as well. So they're focusing on safe food and drink, especially inspecting milk, which children will drink. They're looking at creating safer communities, having playgrounds for kids to play at in a safe area. They're interested in juvenile courts and how you can separate out juvenile offenders from adult offenders. They're looking for better facilities for those juvenile delinquents and for prisoners themselves in the state of Texas, which are pretty brutal at this point in time. They're looking into raising the age of consent, because very, very young girls were considered legally able to give consent for sex, and they thought that shouldn't be. They thought that age of consent needed to be raised. And so there's all sorts of things that they're interested in. Each community wants the vote to do something with it. So when we ask what women want to do, a lot of that depends on what those women want. So you can start with white progressive women and all of these progressive reforms, but for Black progressive women, they want those reforms and they want safety for their communities, and they're fighting lynching, and they're trying to maintain some access to the ballot for Black men who have largely been disenfranchised, at least in Texas and throughout most of the South. In Texas, from the all-white primary and the poll tax passed in 1902 and 1903, respectively.
Thank you for that. It looks like activism was at the center of that desire to get the vote. What would the results be, et cetera, or where those women were fighting to engage in the political sphere? Minnie Fisher Cunningham in Texas was a key figure in the suffrage fight. Why was she so passionate about women's rights to vote specifically?
So yeah, they all want the vote to do something, right? There's something that they think needs to be fixing, and they think their voice is going to help get that thing fixed. For Cunningham, she starts out working as a pharmacist, and she has her degree, and she realizes that the male pharmacists who don't have their degree are making a lot more money than she does with her degree, and that infuriates her. And then she ends up in Galveston shortly after the storm of 1900, and there's this massive push for progressive women to clean up the island, to plant new trees all over the island, which today are tree sculptures around the island after they died during Hurricane Ike. There's a problem with spoiled milk being sold to children in Galveston, and so she jokes that she rode into suffrage on a wave of spoiled milk, right? That she's trying to get these companies to stop poisoning little kids, because they would put all sorts of things into the American food supply and no one regulated it. So there's all sorts of reforms. The pay gap and keeping kids safe is a lot of what motivates Cunningham. In several of her letters, she writes about seeing very young children going off to work and how much this really eats at her sense of justice, and that those kids should be in a classroom. They shouldn't be working at 5, 6, 7 years old. And so a lot of the suffragists, including Cunningham, were kind of motivated by multiple factors.
Gotcha. Thank you so much. Well, we know that suffrage was complicated and problematic in regards to race. It was no different in Texas. Heroic suffragists of color have been left out of the history nationally and locally. What was the position of Minnie Fisher Cunningham and her organization, the Texas Equality Suffrage Association, on African American women joining that group and engaging in the movement in Texas?
So the Texas Equal Suffrage Association, TESA, run by Cunningham, she's their president, is a subsidiary of the National American Woman Suffrage Association, or NAWSA. And the national leaves it up to the states. If your state organization wants to allow Black women's clubs, they can. And if your state organization doesn't want to do that, they don't have to. For Cunningham, Texas is a southern state, right? And she knows that if women's suffrage is linked to Black voting, it will fail in Texas. And she got a little hint of this early in her career. She actually, in response to an argument about how women's suffrage will just give Black people the right to vote, she writes an op-ed in Galveston talking about this stuff and basically says, you know, these women deserve the right to vote. Are you really, you know, so interested in keeping someone who probably legally should have the right to vote from voting that you would bar all of these women? And she very quickly found out the answer was yes. And her strategy is basically to not discuss race whatsoever. So you're not even going to see her argue that the poll tax and the all-white primary will keep Black people from voting. She's going to sidestep that question altogether, because if suffrage is linked to Black voting, she says it's not going to pass. And frankly, in a southern state, she's probably right. So we do have Black suffrage groups in the state of Texas, most famously in El Paso. They apply, and they know they can't probably get by with being a member of TESA, so they try to apply directly to NASA. NASA doesn't know what's going on, so they send the application back to Cunningham and say, you know, what's going on here? So they write to the women in El Paso and figure out, oh, this is a Black women's club that they're trying to, you know, register and be part of the official, you know, TESA and NASA structure. And so Carrie Chapman Catt at NASA and Cunningham and TESA kind of go back and forth. What are we going to do about this? And they basically decide to ask her to quietly resend her application so that it doesn't, you know, make suffrage linked to Black voting. And in a very kind of vague way, they say, you know, it'll be easier to get all of us the right to vote if, you know, you kind of step away. But it's very obvious they don't really mean all of us, right? When they say women, they don't really mean women. They're talking about white women. That being said, Black women do not stop fighting for that right to vote. By 1918, women have negotiated primary suffrage in the state of Texas, so they can vote in the primary, which only takes a simple state law to make that happen. They can't vote in the actual election, which would require a constitutional amendment and a lot more political will to make that happen. So we've already got an all-white primary. It's enforced mainly by local officials, so it's not enforced, you know, all over the state. It's not that no Black person can vote, but very rarely would a Black person be able to vote in the primary in the state of Texas. Even so, groups of Black, especially church women, go and insist on being registered to vote. Now, most of them know they will not be allowed to legally vote, right? They're going to be turned away from the polls, but they still want to register. They want to get that little bit closer to being a voting citizen. And in Houston, they hardly have an NAACP at this point. But when the registrar turns the women away, they actually go to the NAACP. They get a letter saying that they are going to sue this registrar if he doesn't allow these Black women to register. And the registrar backs down. He lets them register, right? They hardly have an NAACP, but they're already starting, right, to kind of push those motions. In Orange, Texas, they actually do sue the registrar for refusing to let a group of Black church women vote. They, you know, the announcement was made at Sunday in church, and then they all went on Monday down to the courthouse together, and they were turned away. So they did sue. It went to court. The judge threw it out, right, unjustly. But when Cunningham found out that there was this group of Black women suing for the right just to register, she assumes it's an anti-suffragist ploy, that anti-suffragists have put these women up to it and they're trying to take down the primary suffrage law. Once you hit 1920 and you actually get the 19th Amendment ratified and women can vote in the state of Texas, the fact that the all-white primary is not applied equally across the board becomes very scary to white supremacists in government. They are terrified at even the small number of women who are able to pay that poll tax and vote in a general election, probably not the primary. And so for the first time in state history, the state legislates the primary, and it makes it the job of the state to enforce an all-white primary. Now that sounds terrible, and it is, but the silver lining is because they overstepped their grounds, that is the Achilles heel of the all-white primary, and that's what eventually why the Supreme Court will take it down, that it was by state action that they are turning away Black voters.
I love that your depiction of the strength and determination of these Black women to really just go in there and take their right to vote and not take no for an answer. That's really inspiring. I know that Black women were not the only ones who were left out of the suffrage movement in Texas. Can you talk to us a little bit about the Rights of Tahanis?
Sure. So of course, the United States conquers parts of Mexico, and that's how Texas becomes part of the United States to begin with. And under the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, all of those Mexican citizens who are now living in American territory are allowed to be American citizens if they want to be, right? So they're supposed to be treated the same way, socially, civilly, all of those rights. And yet they're not, right? We know that those rights are not respected in the way that white citizens' rights are respected. After the Civil War, in the Reconstruction Constitution in Texas and in a lot of southern states, one of the things they add is immigrant voting. And the reason they do this in Texas is there was a large German immigrant population in the state that had largely not supported secession. And so it was a way to enfranchise voters who didn't support that kind of old South stuff, right? So now you don't need to be a citizen to vote in the state of Texas. You just need to be a declarant immigrant, right? So the legal term at the time is a legal resident alien. We say declarant immigrants today. So these are immigrants who have filed their first papers. They have declared their intention to become citizens. They're not citizens yet. Now, they're not just immigrants either. They are expected to be loyal to the United States. They can be tried for treason. They can be drafted into the US military in wartime. So they're in kind of this liminal state of not quite citizenship, but they can vote. And in South Texas, with all of the migrant workers, especially in agricultural in the South of Texas, we develop a system of boss rule. So when we talk about political machines, people tend to think of like cities on the East Coast, being the only people who are kind to immigrants and then, voting them as a block. But that largely happens in South Texas as well. The all-white primary does not apply to Mexicans because of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. And the poll tax applies, but in most cases, the bosses would pay the poll taxes for their workers. So suffragists get it in their head that this is the only type of Mexican voter, right? This controlled block voter, even though there's plenty of Mexican American and Mexican immigrants throughout the state who are not part of this controlled vote. So one of the goals of the progressives in the state is really to disfranchise these immigrants. And this is not unique to Texas. In at least 3 states, the state amendment that would have enfranchised women would have required voters to be citizens for the very first time in that state's history. And that's true in Texas. So the other thing to take into account here is that women by the 20th century have dependent citizenship in the United States. So if we were still under these laws, I would not be a citizen based on the fact that I was born here. I would only be a citizen because my husband is a citizen. So if you as a citizen woman marry an immigrant man who's not a citizen, you lose your birthright citizenship for life. If he naturalizes, you can become a naturalized citizen along with him. You create stateless women this way because they've lost their American citizenship, but their immigrant husband's country doesn't recognize them as a citizen either. So it creates this big mess. And the reverse is true as well. So if you're an immigrant to the United States, you're female, and you marry a citizen man, you automatically get his birthright citizenship. After women's suffrage, this is a big problem, right, for if you're a nativist. So the suffrage movement have been fighting for women's independent citizenship ever since it was passed in 1907. But once women can vote, and the idea that these immigrants are coming to the United States, and the second they're married, they're citizens with voting rights, nativists get very motivated to change women's independent citizenship. And we get the first step towards that with the Cable Act, where women can marry immigrants and retain their citizenship, but only if those immigrants are racially eligible for US citizenship. So women's citizenship will still be very haphazard based on their marriage for several more decades. So we get to 1918, we've got that primary suffrage bill. And I've already said there's a poll tax and an all-white primary. Those are the only 2 Jim Crow kind of voting laws across the state. But the legislature is concerned, if we give women the right to vote in the primary, what about those immigrant women, right? So their status doesn't change with first paper immigrants, but what about Americans of Mexican descent? And what about Mexican immigrants who have obtained citizenship? So to fix that, they add the only literacy test in Texas history to that bill. So men didn't even have to sign their name to register, which is to pay your poll tax. Women didn't have to pay the poll tax, but they had to fill out the form in their own hand. It's the only form of a literacy test the state ever had. And Cunningham says to Kat in a letter that she didn't like it, but she didn't have time to fight it. She needed the bill to get through, and it was mainly aimed at Latinas anyway. right? And of course, that's not the word she uses, but that's the group that she says it's aimed at. 1919, we get a state suffrage amendment in the state of Texas that would have enfranchised women, but it was really a citizenship voting amendment. It would have required voters to be citizens for the very first time, which would have completely disfranchised all of those immigrants in South Texas and Central Texas, still massive populations of German and Mexican immigrants in the state. And Cunningham basically doesn't run a women's suffrage campaign in 1919. She runs a citizenship campaign. And this is just the tail end of World War I. It's all this patriotism. And so it's, if you care about American citizenship, vote for this amendment. All of the flyers talks about citizens, right? Not necessarily about women. And it fails, right? Women can't vote for it. Immigrants can. It's kind of obvious how that would normally shake out. 5 weeks later, Texas ratifies the 19th Amendment anyway, thanks to a lot of work by the suffragists. But the next year, 1921, we have another citizenship law, another citizenship amendment that comes up that would make voting limited to citizens. And this time, they can't enfranchise women, they've already done that. This time, they're gonna make it legal for a spouse to pay their spouse's poll tax. So the whole point of that is to make it so that middle-class women don't have to go pay their poll tax. They can have their husbands do it for them. And this time, with the votes of white women, it passes. So that's the first time Texas restricts voting to citizens. It's off the votes of these newly enfranchised, mostly white women.
Right. Thank you so much for setting up that background. I think it really lays out how complicated the voting rights are both then and now, and how all these other things like citizenship play an important part. I really appreciate you setting up that background for us. Dr. Bejarano, thanks for joining us to share your thoughts. After the passage of the 19th Amendment, as well as the 15th Amendment before that, how were women of color kept from exercising their right to vote, and what finally gave them full access to the polls?
Hello, thank you for that question. And Professor Gunter led us in and started to mention some of the things that were additional restrictions that were keeping women from expressing the right to vote. So we had the 19th Amendment, supposed to have given everybody, all the women, the right to vote, but we know that we have to understand that suffrage was not provided automatically to all women at the same time. So we still had to work to have the government step in to invalidate additional restrictions on the vote for racial and ethnic minorities, which we've heard before, things like the literacy tests, property requirements, informal and formal white primary laws, poll taxes. And so when we had 1965, we had the Voting Rights Act passed, where the federal government's going to step in and especially watch out for some states and localities that were known to be offenders of trying to suppress the efforts to register and to vote for racial and ethnic minorities, including Texas. And with the Voting Rights Act, when it first got passed in 1965, it's mainly addressing Blacks' ability to vote. And it included things like having the federal government step in and do pre-clearance. So whenever cities and states wanted to make some big changes to their voting requirements or laws or districts, they would have to get approval by the federal government first. And I'll stop there because I know you're about to ask another question.
Yeah, there's a lot of things that go on between 1957 and the early 70s. Voting Rights Act, Civil Rights Act, the ERA that is put forward too. We'd love to talk about all those issues, but we just don't have time today. We're going to have another session on those. What I'd like to talk to you about is the lesser discussed 1975 Voting Rights Act extension and the impact that it had for people of color, especially those in Texas.
Okay, great. Let me just share a slide if I can just show you. There we go. There we go. So hopefully you could see this slide just to sort of give everybody a visual for what we've been talking about in terms of 19th Amendment and 1920, but we still had to wait quite a while until different racial and ethnic groups had the full ability to register and vote. So we had several extensions to the Voting Rights Act, and like you mentioned, there was a couple of big ones in 1970 and 1975 that broadened the coverage of the act to protect more racial and ethnic minorities. And this especially was going to be helpful for Latinos and Asian Americans, including places in Texas. So when they were watching over certain areas that had been known to be offenders of the full ability to register and vote, when we broadened the areas we were going to watch in 1970 and 75, it broadened them to include more groups like Latinos who were representing a sizable portion of some areas and some districts, and who also had to show that they were not just illiterate, but that they had the English language literacy to be able to fully express their right to vote. So in 1975, the VRA included language protections. And so this is going to be where we now sort of take it for granted that if you want to go register and vote, then, and you don't have English as your dominant language, you can be provided in many places in the country, be provided with that election material in your other language. So for Latinos, they can be provided that ballot in Spanish and be able to still fully express the right to vote, even though they don't have the English language dominance. And so this is a big factor that's going to influence more racial and ethnic minority women and have more protections from the federal government. And just like you see in your graphic, there's also additional restrictions, though. We've talked a lot, we could talk a lot, probably a whole nother session about how the Voting Rights Act was so important, but it has been diluted in the strength that it has. So in 2013, we have the Shelby versus Holder Supreme Court decision that took away some of the strength of those pre-clearance, which is basically when the federal government would watch for those repeat offenders and check up if they wanted to make big changes to their voting requirements and their district makeup. And so we are now waiting for the Voting Rights Act to be strengthened after this Shelby decision. So we're still waiting on that. But then we also have the fact that formerly incarcerated women in many places throughout the country also have don't have the full ability to vote because of the fact that they were incarcerated. So it just gives you an example of the full breadth, and we could continue talking about this fight for the vote.
Right, and listening to you, Dr. Bejarano, and also to Dr. Gunter, I feel like we've made a lot of strides, but we're still struggling with that true equal rights. We're still struggling with these social issues that we want to address, which whether it's health and insurance and those sorts of things, and the protection of our community and equal pay in this process. So I feel like that struggle is still underway. Can you talk about, and I'd also like to introduce Dr. Ricks to this question as well, what do you both see as the ongoing barriers for the true equality of women today? Dr. Bejarano, you want to go first?
I'll go first? Okay.
Yes, ma'am.
So let me share another slide with you. So the biggest thing that I think we still have to talk about, we were talking about the fight for the right to vote, but there's also increased voter suppression efforts that we now have to watch out for. So the current climate of voting rights still shows that we have still many challenges with these increased efforts, like voter identification laws, which we do have in Texas. So this is strict requirements on allowed forms of identification that you have to show so that you can vote. And there is more than 10% of American citizens who don't possess these government issued forms of identification. That's more than 20 million citizens. And minority voters are disproportionately more likely to lack this required form of identification. Then there's also additional residency restrictions, registration restrictions, and those are going to increase those hurdles that groups have to jump through. And then something else to keep in mind is that there's intersectional considerations. So, but women who are young, low income, elderly, disabled, women of color, and transgender are also more negatively affected by these voter identification laws because they require that documentation, for example, marriage license or birth certificates. And then there's even things to consider, which again, we could talk about this at length, but there's even certain restrictions that most of us are not aware of, but some states will even limit the number of children you can take to the polls with you. So this is also going to negatively impact women and mothers who are thinking about, okay, do I go and vote? But I have the kids with me. I can't just leave them in the car. What do I do? So just thinking about those additional restrictions that we may take for granted when we go to vote, when we have the time, when we have the documentation, when we have the ability where we're maybe not caretaking for our family or loved ones or children.
Thank you. Those are really great points. I know that it, impacts low-income families even more because of what you said, not being able to get daycare or not being able to take off from work in order to get to the polls. So those are really important restrictions on our right to vote, if you will. Dr. Ricks, could you please answer that same question? What do you see as the ongoing barriers for the true equality of women today?
Yes, good afternoon. First, I would like to thank you for organizing this event, you and your wonderful team. It's very timely and I'm glad to be a part of it. So many of the same barriers that we saw in the suffrage movement and in the civil rights movements, they're the same, they mirror each other. We are basically seeing some of the same problems, the same barriers. And many of them are definitely more obvious than others. You've already named the lack of childcare, lack of adequate housing. We're still dealing with racism, economic inequality, gender-based discrimination. And I also, our not so just system that, there's a justice system for one group and then there's another justice system for women and people of color. And 100 years later, a mother can get more time for voting while she's on probation than a man can get for a sexual assault charge. 100 years later, I mean, that is just, that's not okay. So I think even lack of flexibility in the workplace, lack of women in leadership, in especially women of color. And I think one of the ones that we really are not talking about as much is complacency. We've seen some change, but it's been slow and it's not enough, especially 100 years later. We must imagine what is radically possible in terms of equality for women. We have to imagine that, and then we have to work to build that, to make it happen. And yes, we've seen change, but there's still, as you've mentioned, there's still a lot of work to do. And our response has to be as bold and as explicit as this inequality that we are still experiencing. And so I think we've got to get back to this spirit of sisterhood, this community of sisterhood, and we've got to be ready to fight. We are literally trying to maintain the rights that our suffrage sisters and our civil rights sisters gave us. And so we've got to have everybody on board. It has to be everybody, regardless of your gender, your sexual orientation. We need all boots on deck. We cannot go to war without troops. And so my hope is at the end of this panel presentation that everybody that is watching has this newfound sense of we've got work to do and we can no longer be complacent about it, and we've got to continue to fight. We've got to get into some good trouble, as the late John Lewis used to say, and we can't play around with it. Our suffrage sisters, they didn't play around, and we have much more resources than they do. And I would like to see us begin to exercise that. We're so divided as a country now, and we cannot politicize our sisterhood. We've got work to do.
Thank you for that. I completely agree that this needs to continue to be a movement. It's not over. Because we passed the 19, We've got a lot of work to do, and I love those inspiring words from you. From your professional perspective, what potential community solutions do you see to address this ongoing inequality?
Yes. Community is going to be vital and very important. The first thing we've got to start addressing in communities is the inequality that we have in the education system. The education is the vehicle to financial security, to more options, for folks to leave poverty. So I encourage folks to have more information and insight into their Board of Educations and their independent ISDs. Who are these superintendents? Are they there because they really are passionate and want to see change? Are they there to advance their careers? How are they managing a budget? Do you have a diverse board? You know, are there women on this board? Are there people of color? We have a diverse sexual orientation. It's important that the board mirrors what the population of the students and the community is. So find out when that Board of Education meets. Recruit your neighbors, go together. Ask those hard questions. What are the challenges in this district? How are you addressing these challenges? And, you know, what are some innovative programs that we have? And encourage your children to go as well. So education, there's so much inequality in education. So these students are not getting that foundation of equal chance. And so some of you may remember, I think it was like 2016, there were some high school students in South Dallas who, I think it was South Dallas, South Oak Cliff High School, and they literally staged a walkout of their school because the conditions of that school were so wildly inappropriate. And that no student should have to walk out of their school because the conditions are not adequate. That would not happen in suburban areas. And so we've got to really hold these people accountable in the Board of Education. If they're not doing their job, vote them out. Volunteer, get outside of your community, volunteer at places like the Boys and Girls Club, Big Brothers and Big Sisters, partner with faith-based organizations. Oftentimes the Black church or other faith-based organizations in communities of color, those are the pillars in the community. So even in my research with teen pregnancy prevention, as a Black woman, I can't go into those Black communities and tell these women what they need. I had to partner with the gatekeepers and ask them what it is that they want so that I can align with them. And they told me what it is I can do to help them. So some other things people can do is join social action groups and grassroots organizations. I'm a part of several of those organizations and they keep me pretty busy. It's really good to align with people who share some of the goals and passions that you have. Also, get involved in your own community. You will be surprised about what you may find out about your own community. What really drives your community? Are they speaking out on certain things that are going on in the world around you? Are they just in this bubble? So it's sign petitions. I mean, all of that is important. March, protest. The march is a historical weapon that has been used to expose injustice, and there is powers in numbers. And so those are some things that we can do within the community level to address inequality. But one of the most important things is for everybody to remain hopeful and optimistic. It's going to be a long fight. We cannot give up. Our suffrage sisters did not give up. When they did not win in one state, they were hopeful that they would win in another state. And when they didn't win in that state, they kept fighting. And this happened for decades. And they eventually had to just pass the torch to the next generation of women to continue the fight. So young people, we are really dependent on you to take us to the next level in this fight as well. So everybody has to do something. There's enough to do for everybody.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ricks, for that call to action. I hope that these students heed that because there is a place for their voice in policy and political activities right now. More and more young people are running for school boards, for example,
Right.
which, as you said, who knows it better than those students who have just left those institutions.
Right.
So I love that call to action and I appreciate it. Thank you so much. Can you talk a little bit more about maybe the strategies that we can implement to advocate for public policy changes that directly impact women?
Yes, things that we can do. A lot of what I'm proposing today is to hold people accountable and vote them out. And that's what we have to do. We have to make some noise while we wait. But conduct research on your county commissioners, your city council, as y'all may have seen throughout this pandemic. They have a more direct impact on our daily lives. And so who are they? What do they do? When do they meet? So you're able to go to these meetings. A lot of them are being held virtual now. You can call in and speak. Again, who is your mayor? Who is your police chief? Who is the sheriff, the judges? All those people matter. And again, you can write letters to them. So you can advocate about, housing vouchers that maybe, that more women need housing that are in safer communities. So why can't we have housing in more safer, better parts of the community rather than the worst parts of the community? So write those letters, raise your voice, and this is whether you have kids or not, because it impacts the community. How they're going to address inadequate childcare. What about health insurance? It's hard for a woman to work if she does not have health insurance and she doesn't have a safe place to send her children. So it's this cycle that's being perpetuated from one generation to the next. And so it's really holding these folks accountable. And if they're not, vote them out. And when you go to these platforms, take your children with you. Have your children write letters, because they do have the experience. You can write an op-ed letter or letter to the director, the editor of a newspaper, and share your expertise. This provides exposure and awareness. You can participate in a town hall meeting, something that you could develop yourself, that you can create and bring your community members together, set the agenda, and then ask one of your city members to come speak. Ask them those hard questions. Use your social media platform, Facebook, Twitter, whatever it is, and use those hashtags and call those your city leaders out, your state leaders out. Hashtag women equality, adequate health care for women. Hashtag trans lives matter. Hashtag Black lives matter. Use those hashtags and call these people out. Meet with your Congress people. You can go when they're in congressional recess. Be prepared, have a list of questions. I mean, there is a lot that we can do. There's so much at stake, and we just got to make sure that we're doing our due diligence at every level so we can hold these folks accountable.
Absolutely. And thank you for reminding all of us that our voice is significant. First step is your vote is significant. The next step is absolutely what you said, reaching out, communicating, talking, showing up at meetings. All of that is so important, especially with our young voices. They're going to live with the consequences of whatever these politicians decide for the longest, right? Yeah. For their entire life. Yeah.
A little bit more on the voting. Sure. They need to vote. Know your candidates. Have a plan. It's not good enough today to say I'm going to vote. Have a plan. Are you going to request an absentee ballot? If so, when are you going to request that? Get that in early. Be sure to submit it early. If you're going to vote early, where are you going to go vote? Who are you taking with you? Do you know where to go vote? Do all this research and share it with folks so that they can be knowledgeable as well. And I really want to make a statement to folks that think my vote doesn't count. I've been hearing a lot of this and it frustrates me, especially after hearing what all these women have gone through. Your vote matters, your vote counts. If it didn't, they would not be trying so hard to suppress it. So vote and take somebody with you.
Absolutely. I agree 110%. That's my big superpower, is my desire to get everyone registered to vote, everyone out there. October 5th is the last day to register to vote. If you're not registered, you can't even think about whether or not you want to go to the polls. Right. So the Texas Women's Foundation Economic Report for 2020 identifies that there are 2.3 million women in Texas living at or below the poverty line. In addition, women are still making less than men with the same education level. The median average yearly wage for women in Texas with a college degree is $49,000, while men with the same credentials make over $67,000. I want to ask both you, Dr. Ricks and Dr. Bejarano, what can we do to strengthen equal pay for equal work policies that could reduce that income wage gap, especially for women of color? Because when you look at the stats, it becomes even more exaggerated when you're looking at Black women, Latina women, etc. Talk to us, Dr. Ricks, about that, and then we'll go to you, Dr. Bejarano.
So there are a lot that can be done. I think one of the main things is that we're going to need more men allies, period, point blank. We have to. Just as people of color, we cannot eradicate racism on our own. Women are going to need men to start stepping up and holding these companies, these agencies accountable. We've got to speak up. It reminds me of Kobe Bryant when he was advocating for women in the NBA to be paid better because he has daughters. And men have to understand that inequality for women impacts their daughters, their sisters. And so we are going to need more men allies to speak up for us. And then we need, everybody's talking about diversity and inclusion, but nobody's really talking about diversity and inclusion. So especially for women of color, these corporations are going to have plans in place to say, we're going, because we get the education. Women get the education. We can get the job. Oftentimes, especially in male-dominated professions, they don't stay because there's something in that culture that prevents women from staying. So I think organizations and companies are going to have to be more explicit about retaining women, paying them equitably, and developing them professionally, and having this trajectory of promotion so that women are not having to choose between a promotion and their family.
Yes.
We need more flexible work schedules for everybody and not just for women, because family composition is so diverse now. And so those are some of the things that are going to have to be done in order to see that pay gap decrease. It needs to be gone away with.
Thanks so much for that. Dr. Bejarano, can you pipe in on this question?
Yes, so I'll go back to what Dr. Ricks was pointing out. We also have to vote. So you have to vote to get elected officials to office that will pass more legislation to fight for equal pay. So for example, President Obama, his first bill that he signed into office when he was elected president was the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act. So this was an important piece and we still need a lot more to go until we have things like the Equal Rights Amendment in our Constitution. We have to fight for different pieces of legislation that could help us get us closer to equal rights for women, including equal pay. So things like the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act, it allows for a longer clock till when you get your paycheck, for example. You have to then think, well, how do I even know if I don't have the same amount of pay as the males? Some businesses, if you try to talk about how much you get paid with your coworkers, you could get fired.
Yep.
So it's hard to even figure out how you figure out that you're not getting paid. And Lilly Ledbetter figured it out after she was getting ready to retire. She found out she had been getting paid less than her male coworkers. But there was a timeline, so there was a clock in terms of once you got your first paycheck, you needed to know you were getting paid less and then fight it. And that clock had already run out for her. So it was just even thinking about the logistics of how do you provide for more opportunities to even figure out, first off, whether you are getting paid less, and then how do you fight it? Is there time allowed? Can you fight it and not get retaliation and get fired from your boss? So we need to vote to get people elected to office who can think about all those logistics to include more legislation to help us fight for that equal pay.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. And I think you're all getting this theme that you've got to get out there and vote. And then once you vote, you have got to get involved with the people that you have chosen to govern. Educate yourself on the issues, participate in civil discussions about this so that we can actually come together and make good governance for all of us. And don't forget, you guys, Your voice is important, and there's absolutely no reason why you can't run for political office yourself, whether it's a board, a commission, elected office. Start local. That's where the important decisions that impact our everyday life are made. At the Center for Women in Politics and Public Policy, that's absolutely our main goal, is to educate you guys on your voice, how important it is for you to become civically engaged and learn about the policy issues that impact us all in your careers, in your everyday life, etc. So make sure that you guys are really reaching out. This was incredible, and I feel inspired and excited and really appreciative of this entire panel today. I wanted to remind you guys before we get out of here that tomorrow the Center for Women in Politics and Public Policy is sponsoring an entire day on health policy. And we're talking to legislators from Texas, women legislators, and getting their perspective on this. And then we're also talking to national level policy makers and influencers who are talking about health inequalities, women and children's health, food insecurity, how that process works and how we can insert ourselves into it. So we just want to make sure that you guys have every opportunity to get as much information as you can to become informed and engaged in the process. I'm going to turn it back over to Susan. I know there may be like one question that I see up on the screen, but again, thank you all. This was incredible, and I do feel energized and excited about all of the women who are really engaged in making sure that we don't forget the struggle and know that it's still real for us here today, and are really trying to reach out and empower the voices of all those around us.
Great, we just have a few minutes left. One of the questions was, will there be a recorded version? Yes, we're going to send a link to everyone who registered. We have one kind of heavy question here, but if anybody has a short answer to this question, how do you suggest we reconcile the glorified version of history, the important things that people have accomplished, with their bigotry or hateful actions? Is there a short answer to this?
The short version is we can celebrate the good without excusing the bad.
Thanks.
That we can be grown up enough to understand that people are complicated. We're not all good. We're not all bad. We've all got a little bit of both. Some people have a little more than others. Yes. And we can handle a complicated history. So we're not denigrating the suffrage movement by acknowledging its flaws, and that includes the racism and nativism of most white suffragists, just like we're not denigrating the United States by acknowledging its, larger history, which again is the good, the bad, and the ugly. We just need to be specific about what in this movement, or in our nation's history for that matter, that we're celebrating or commemorating, and what we are critiquing, and not confuse the two.
Well, thank you for that. Dr. Ricks or Dr. Bejarano, would you like to add to that?
I think it was well said. I think you tell the truth, acknowledge it, and move on and do the work.
Yeah, thanks. Great.
I think I have nothing to add. Yeah, I would agree with everybody else. Yeah, this is also something that, being in the US, at least one thing I can say is we are allowed to think about the good and the bad and how we can make things better. So we are allowed to criticize and protest and fight for a better government and be part of it by voting and by taking action and by protesting, so that we can try to make it a better place for everybody.
Well, panelists, I thank you so much for your being here today. I do have one last question, and that is the film, Citizens at Last. Might we be expecting that for a fall or winter release? Ellen or Nancy?
I think you're muted, Ellen.
Nancy, why don't you answer?
Yeah, we're going to come out with a film for Women's History Month, probably around the 15th of March. So it'll be on local PBS stations and offered nationwide as well. And we'd love to do a screening at TWU.
Great. Well, I would love to meet you in person, hopefully our situation will be that we could have a live event. Well, once again, thank you to the panelists and thanks to everyone who attended. And October 5th is the last day to register to vote in order to vote for the November 3rd election. Early voting starts October 13th. If you would like to learn how to register to vote, you can just type that question in your browser. And there are lots of ways to register to vote in your area. Well, thanks to everyone and have a good day.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Great to meet you all.
Nice to meet everyone. Bye-bye.
Thanks,
Bye.
guys.